In this episode of No Holds Barred, we're going to talk about coroner's inquests. And of course, the question is, what's a coroner's inquest? A coroner's inquest is a look into the death of an individual. It's an inquiry, and it's into the circumstances of the death of an individual. Coroner's inquest typically is something put on by the coroner of a county in the state of California, or anywhere in the country for that matter, but we're going to talk about California law and coroner's inquests. A coroner is generally the sheriff in the county of Contra Costa. It's David Livingston, who is a big supporter of coroner's inquests and has coroner's inquests every time there is any law enforcement involvement with a death. And that can mean somebody dies of old age in the jail of natural causes, or there can be a car chase, there could be a suicide at the jail, there could be a police shooting, any involvement at all of law enforcement in Contra Costa County, California, has a coroner's inquest. There's been a great deal of interest lately about the idea of a coroner's inquest. Why would we have one? Why is there an inquiry into the death? Because it is actually designed at an early stage to put out into the open the circumstances of the death of an individual when law enforcement is involved. And I think very important that that happen, and certainly our sheriff understands that and does that. I will say many other counties send representatives to watch our coroner's inquests here in Contra Costa County, California, with the idea that they want to also do them. I've done coroner's inquests up in Mendocino County, in Glenn County. I've been approached to do them in San Joaquin County, and I assisted people down in LA County in putting together a coroner's inquest. It's interesting, there was an article as recently as 2015 in the LA Times about we should bring back coroner's inquests. And I contacted or attempted to contact that writer for the LA Times and said, we've been doing coroner's inquests nonstop in Contra Costa County since about 1982. Never got a response back from him. But his argument was a good argument, and that is when we have the politics of police interaction with individuals and a death, it's important to get out in front of it, to put out, for good or for bad, the circumstances of the death and to let people see. I did a little study in 2015 myself, having nothing to do with that Times article. I just gathered up all the cases that I'd done as the hearing officer for coroner's inquests and looked at how many of them actually resulted in lawsuits. And at the time, I want to say there were something like 69 that I had presided over, and there had been 9 lawsuits as a result of that. Why is that? I would argue because it's the first time the actual facts of the incident have been put out in the public domain. Many times the first time a decedent's family has seen the actual facts, what happened and why did it happen. And when it's put out like that and people have a chance to see it, to review it, to know what happened, many times to see body cams or dash cams to really see what happened, they understand, okay, now I understand what happened. But important to put it out in the open. We need this kind of transparency in today's world more than ever. And that was the argument in that article in the LA Times. And I'm pleased to say we do it, and we regularly do it. And I'm called many times to confer with other counties just to see if they want to do coroner's inquest. And people seem to think that they want to do. What is something that comes out of it? What does a jury do? Look at the government code, and that really is what drives and lays out the system of coroner's inquests in the state of California, the government code. So you can have a hearing officer, you can have a judge do it, which is kind of a hearing officer. You can have it in front of a jury. You can have the hearing officer make the findings. In Contra Costa County, in all cases, we use a jury. And the government code says you allow anywhere from 9 to 15 jurors. In some cases, in a case up in Glenn County, I did have 15 jurors. In a recent case here in Contra Costa County, we had 15 jurors as well because it was a political case, a highly political case, and we wanted to make sure that we had enough jurors with the thought that some of the jurors would say they heard about the case and couldn't participate. That didn't happen. We kept all those jurors. So at any rate, 9 to 15. And the jurors decide at the end of the case one of 4 modes or manners of death. And I'll say, in the United States, most deaths can be defined in one of the 4 stated modes. And the first is natural causes, and not in order. The second is accident. The third is suicide. And the fourth is at the hands of another other than by accident. And we have jury instructions that we give to the jurors in all coroner's inquests. We read them out loud to them, and then they have them when they are deliberating in their jury deliberations, the definitions of each and every one of those causes of death. Sometimes we have, let's say, suicide by cop. So we've crafted jury instructions so that a jury can make a determination that, in fact, somebody precipitated the use of force against them with the idea that they wanted the police to shoot them. So we've had such cases where, for example, somebody raised the gun at the police. The gun was empty, but the police certainly didn't know that, and pointed at the police. The police thought the person was going to shoot, and so several officers fired their weapons and the person was killed. The jury returned with a verdict of suicide, and it was essentially what we call suicide by cop. It is important, in my view, to put out the circumstances in these various cases. Now, I did one up in Mendocino County you might have heard about. Is 2 women had adopted 6 children out of Texas, and at some point they brought them down to California and drove them off the cliff, killing themselves and all 6 of the kids, although one of the bodies was never recovered. The jury returned with a verdict of suicide as to the 2 adults, and at the hands of another other than by accident, which essentially is homicide, murder as to the 6 children. An interesting thing about that case, they drove them off the cliff into the Pacific Ocean, and the water would churn up over a series of days different bits of evidence that weren't recovered immediately afterwards. And one of them was a Garmin device, a device that had been on the vehicle since the vehicle was new, something back in 2008 or something. And by looking at that device, it went to a lab in Sacramento, and they could determine everywhere that vehicle had been. And it traveled the path down from Washington through Oregon, stopping at a Walmart store, and actually purchased generic medicines that were then given to the children, and the children had very, very high amounts of that medicine. The passenger had 40 times the normal dose of that particular medicine. And what is that medicine? It's a medicine that puts you to sleep, and that's in fact what happened. The driver, who generally didn't drink, had alcohol in her system. So what appeared shortly thereafter, churning up from the ocean floor, was a phone, a cell phone. And you think you accidentally drop your cell phone into the bathtub or the toilet, and guess what? It's not recoverable. Oh no, this was recovered and found that there was research on that phone that said how much of this particular medicine can kill a person, how long can a person live in the ocean before they die of hypothermia, a number of interesting things that led the evidence to show and the facts to show and the jury to conclude that the driver and the passenger, the 2 adults, planned this and planned to come down to some place where there was an ocean and drive this car off the cliff and kill themselves and kill the children. So an interesting, very interesting coroner's inquest. I did another coroner's inquest where a person actually committed suicide. There were no officer involved, but the coroner can decide to have an inquest even if there is not an officer-involved situation. In Contra Costa County, we do it in all cases. So, for example, a car chase, the police get involved in a chase, and many times call off the pursuit because it's too dangerous, and a couple of miles down the road, the car will run into a tree and somebody dies. And in that case, we still have a coroner's inquest because there's, call it tangential involvement of law enforcement, but nevertheless, law enforcement involvement. So it's something that I believe we're going to see more and more counties and more places in the United States doing coroner's inquests, getting involved in coroner's inquests. And each law enforcement agency has an investigative plan for deaths from their own agency. And that's separate and apart from the coroner's inquest. And that is something that all agencies have. In some cases, an agency will have a death where one of their officers, let's say, for example, shot and killed somebody, and they will have an agency outside, maybe the Department of Justice or a neighboring agency will come in and do an investigation. In Contra Costa County, there's a very, very sophisticated protocol that takes place anytime there is an officer-involved death. As I say, whether it's a suicide in the jail or whatever, and teams of people from the district attorney's office come out and they run a parallel investigation. It's involved in the interviews of the involved officers, the next of kin, any witnesses, police and fire are all interviewed. They look at the body cams, they look at dash cams if they're available. It's all looked at in this very comprehensive investigation. The district attorney's role is to determine whether or not there's criminal conduct on the part of anyone involved, the police agencies or anyone else. The acting agency and the venue agency, in parallel with the district attorney's office, look at it to see whether the agency, the actors acted within the rules of their own agency. Was there a pursuit? Did they act within the rules of their own pursuit policies? Did the officer do things right? Was he faced with danger when he acted? Did he comply with rules? And all of those facts come in, and the jury can take a look at it. People often say, well, it's not really fair. There's only one side, and you as the hearing officer are asking questions. I solicit questions right at the start. I let people know if there are lawyers present representing the parties, representing the family, representing the decedent. They can give me questions, hand them to the attendant. They give me the question. I will read them if they're relevant to our pursuit of the truth in this particular matter. And a coroner's inquest is a court reporter takes down everything that's being said on the record. There is a public record that is created that still can result in prosecutions, separate and apart, or civil cases. So as I was saying at the start, where out of the 69 or 70 cases that I had reviewed, and there were 9 suits, those lawsuits were all civil lawsuits against the police agency that was involved. And generally those are, many cases, we call them civil rights cases that are in federal court. Occasionally there's local jurisdictions, and we have cases in local courts, not particularly often, but that's what is separate and apart. So we can have 3 cases. We could have a criminal case, we could have a civil case, we could have a coroner's inquest. But generally the coroner's inquest is the start of that entire process, and it does not take into account what may or may not happen in a civil lawsuit, what may not happen in a criminal lawsuit. And I've certainly had coroner's inquests over which I've presided, where the jury has returned a verdict, and there has been a prosecution of involved officers for a criminal prosecution. We've certainly seen cases where there is a civil case in federal court. I had a case at one time where somebody in a jail was in a holding cell, and sometimes referred to as a rubber room, because the person was a danger to himself and was afraid that that person was going to commit suicide. And there is a log, and in the jail they watch that person every 15 minutes. They check in on them and see that they're alive and well. They're typically given a suit that can't be torn. And this particular person, they were so concerned about, they didn't give him a little, what they call a spork. It's kind of a combination food fork, plastic to eat. And they gave him a couple pieces of bologna and 4 pieces of bread to make 2 sandwiches. That was it. Nothing to put on them, anything. That person balled up all the bread, stuffed it into their throat, and choked to death, and committed suicide with that. And kind of wondering, there was a lawsuit initially by the family against the agency for failing to protect that person. That lawsuit ultimately was dismissed because it was impossible to look at that agency and see that they had done anything wrong. But those kinds of things can and do happen. In some cases, the officer might be prosecuted, or there might be administrative action. In some cases, there is a criminal case afterwards, and had a case where 2 people were fleeing from the police, a couple of parolees fleeing from the police, and they ran into their vehicle, ran into another vehicle and killed an innocent person. And they were prosecuted. The driver of the vehicle was prosecuted for that vehicular manslaughter of it. So there can be lots and lots of things that happen, but the coroner's inquest is a definite, specific hearing, and it has nothing to do with the civil side or the criminal side. It simply put the facts of the case out in the open, the facts of a death. And again, I want to say Contra Costa County is the gold standard in the state. To my knowledge, I'm the only one in the state of California that regularly does coroner's inquest. I have a very capable backup that was recently retained to assist, and she does some of the coroner's inquests now. But I would estimate I've done probably close to 150 coroner's inquests. I am hopeful that throughout the state of California and throughout the United States, more and more jurisdictions look at the coroner's inquest as a wonderful vehicle for putting out into the open the circumstances of a death. And as I say, in more recent years, in all cases we play dash cams and certainly body cams of the officers involved so that the jury can clearly see what happened. We don't, once the officer files, we don't show any impacts or anything, but what we do show, let the jury see what the officer saw just before he or she fired a weapon, if a weapon was fired, or police pursuits we show. A recent case, we had a drone over a scene of a suicide down to look into the vehicle where an individual had been fleeing the police but stopped his vehicle and then committed suicide within that vehicle. An interesting thing about coroner's inquest that most people don't know is it's entirely open to the public. No witnesses are excluded. I often tell people that if you're really interested in how things work in our system and what a coroner's inquest is, you're welcome to come. And many times we have a courtroom filled with people in particularly troublesome cases, interesting cases, political cases, whatever and people are welcome to come, listen, watch, and see how our system works. Generally, the police officers who are involved testify. As I say, we play those video cams, we play those dash cams. The audience can see them. They can see weapons that are used. They can see everything that happens related to that. And it's interesting because people many times get a little snippet in the newspaper or see a little snippet on the news about a death, and they don't really know. That's all they get. Come to a coroner's inquest. See a coroner's inquest and see what happens. You can certainly Google coroner's inquest in the state of California and look at the government code if you like and see what's required and how the process works, but it's kind of dry and a little bit boring. That's something that I look at and get involved with. But certainly go online and look at coroner's inquests in Contra Costa County, and you can see the results, you can see what happened, you can see the cases that pop up. If you're really interested in how a coroner's inquest happens, one that I did up in Mendocino called the HART, H-A-R-T Family Inquest, and if you Google that or YouTube it, you can watch the entire process from the pathologist going through all of the autopsies and what the findings were, the medical cause of death, to the investigation, what happened, what came up from the seashore, to the interesting detective story that the California Highway Patrol put together in following the family from Minnesota to Oregon, to then Washington, where they lived in all those states, to then ultimately coming down to their deaths in Mendocino County, California. You can see that, and it's very, very interesting. Certainly, I lecture regularly on coroner's inquests and what happens around the state and to various civic organizations and Rotary clubs and all that. And I'm always happy to appear in front of a group if they ask me and talk about our inquest process and what we go through. Generally, the notification of a coroner's inquest goes out. There's a press release that goes out from the coroner's office announcing the inquest, date and time, where it's going to take place. And so if somebody wants to know, certainly the families that are involved get direct notification from the coroner's inquest. And in kind of some high-profile case, you'll read about it in the paper ahead of time. I suppose if somebody's particularly interested and they hear about a case, they could call the coroner's office and say, we've heard that there's a recent death. Do you know when is that coroner's inquest going to take place? From a scheduling standpoint, we always like to have them within 90 to 120 days. However, during the pandemic, in many cases, courts were closed. For a period of time, we were actually doing coroner's inquests with the jury in the new supervisors' chambers in Martinez. And for a period of time, we did them. We're now back in the main courthouse doing them. But that's a way that citizens could find out if they wanted to go directly to the coroner's office, because the coroner's office, which is run by the sheriff's office, it's the sheriff coroner's office, could give that information if somebody's really particularly interested. That concludes our discussion of coroner's inquest, and stay tuned for our next episode of No Holds Barred.